Do you have a hard time adjusting from the time change?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. I feel it on this one.
So do I.
It just depends. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like 9 o'clock. I'm like, oh, but then
I am really tired.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the March King's Board of Education work session. Mr. Morrow, can you please call the roll?
Ms. Phillips,
here,
Ms. Groff,
Here.
Ms. Cowan, Mr. Belfrom,
Here.
Mr. Skrull.
Here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. May I have a motion to approve this evening's agenda?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second the motion.
Mr. Morrow?
Ms. Groff,
Yes.
Ms. Phillips,
Yes,
Ms. Cowan,
Yes.
Mr. Belfrom,
Yes.
Mr. Skrull.
Yes. First item on our agenda this evening is reports and presentations. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mr. Sears.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Skrull. Appreciate everyone this evening and here on this beautiful evening. Wanted to take a few minutes this evening to just provide some data and information to the board and community around where we are with some enrollment changes within our district, some staffing information and financial data as well. Just as we constantly analyze where we are, when we look for efficiencies, when we analyze kind of some comparison numbers, I think this is important data for us to analyze. So as we look to see, are we on track as far as a lot of different things, but it also provides some validation and explanation for some of the issues that we see here in Kings and challenges as well. So we'll kind of walk through this evening. Certainly, board, if you have any questions throughout, let us know. The first slide, I just want to point out, because this will be referenced throughout this conversation, is that over the last few years, since the passage of our last levy, the board and administration have worked significantly to either generate or reduce approximately $7.23 million. These are big numbers, and a lot of effort and work have gone into this as far as hiring practices, some personnel savings plan, insurance changes, a lot of things that have been behind the scenes. And I know we've talked about this previously many times. And this is work that we're doing to make reductions and become more efficient without impacting the classroom instruction and the instructional experience for students. And so we're continuing to work on that daily, and with the goal of approaching approximately $8 million in either revenue generation or savings prior to the start of next school year. So this is stuff we do every day. It's work we're talking about constantly on how we can become more efficient. And we look at every position, every situation, everything as an opportunity to become more efficient over time. So I remind the board and community of this. This is something that we continue to do, and it's a lot of work over the last couple of years as we've tried to become more efficient. So for the rest of this conversation, we're going to look at two different comparison groups. So the first one is a neighbor peer group. And these are neighbor peers that either touch Kings School District or are similar, just that are in the local region. But we've considered that a self-identified neighbor peer group. And then on the right is the Ohio Department of Education workforce identifies the top 10 peers for Kings throughout across the state. So whenever the ODE or ODU analyze our enrollment, performance, efficiencies, lots of different things, they are utilizing that top 10 peers. So it's really important for us to. These districts on the right are made up of similar enrollments, demographics, different densities, property values, income levels. So they are districts that are very similar to Kings across the state. So it's often easier for us to look in our neighborhood or the backyards of our neighbors. But it's also important that we analyze from a state level. This is who we compare to. So the first one will not be a comparison, but it is just and Mrs. Gould, can you go to the next one, please? Thank you. This is just analyzing our enrollment over time. And so you can see we've analyzed this. We constantly talk about it, but in Kings, we have analyzed and looked at enrollment. We have in February reached the 5,000 plateau and status. And so we're continuing to see that over time. You can see where that is the last few years. That trend line is trending up, but you can also see it validated with the data points. On the next one, it looks at grade level enrollment. And so we've talked about this over the past couple of years. And this is just a reminder that currently we have approximately 300 more students. It's almost exactly right now, 300 more students in grades 1 through 6 than 7 through 12. You can see those bars and where they are around the 400 per grade level status. And you can see where we are from a 7 through 12 standpoint. So we're experiencing the growth, we're experiencing enrollment growth, but it's also it identifies well in our lower grades in that 1 through 6 level. We're expecting that to continue. So as we look at this, when we look at our neighbor peers, so let's look at enrollment change over time. So this is one that we can easily, this is taken directly from the ODE school enrollment data throughout the state. This is from 22 through 25. 2022 through 2025, you can look at the enrollment change for neighboring districts. So you can see where Kings is on the far left, about a 3.6% increase in total enrollment. And then Lebanon, Little Miami, Loveland, Mason, Springboro, and Sycamore are to the right. The only districts that currently are seeing growth in this model in the data collected from here is Little Miami and Sycamore. Other districts have a little bit declining enrollment, and some is very minimal, some is a little bit more significant over time. But I think it's important because as much as it's easy to compare ourselves to our neighbors, but not everyone is experiencing growth currently from like we are in Kings. The next slide talks a little bit about Kings growth. So in 2022 through 2025, from the ODE school enrollment data, we break down subgroups based on how the classifications through the Ohio Department of Education, how they identify students. So we have different subgroups identified at the bottom of the graph. With our Asian population of students on the left side, has seen a 91% increase over those 3 years. We've seen increases in the other different subgroups as well. We've seen a decrease in our white students, and we've seen a significant increase in the economically disadvantaged students within our school district. And so it talks about a growing diverse school district that the data identifies, yes, we are growing, but then we are becoming more diverse as a result, not only from an ethnicity standpoint, but also from a socioeconomic standpoint as well. The next one is just a different way to look at ethnicity, just modeled differently, just so it's visually, you could see the colors represent. This is taking out the economically disadvantaged piece of this, but you can see we are a growing, diverse school district with our Asian population growing significantly. And we're seeing that consistently, but our white population is dropping just a little bit, is declining. But overall, as a district, we're continuing to see growth. The next one is enrollment, this is our demographics. If we're identifying from 2020 through 2024, just in Kings, the percentage of economically disadvantaged students, the percentage of students that are identified with a disability, and the orange is the percentage of students with limited English proficiency. So this goes through 2024. So if you start in 2020, you can see that our gray bar of our economically disadvantaged students are approximately 15% of our population, to where they are now in 2024 is almost a 26% of our population. In the brown, you will see our students that are identified with a disability is about 13.5%. We've seen a little bit slower growth in this area, which we've identified in some of our recent discussions as well, that we're approximately 15.5% of our students are identified with a disability. And then in the orange is the percentage of students with limited English proficiency. So these are students that speak other languages in the home or come to Kings with very limited English. They're identified ELL students for us. You can see we've seen explosive growth from 2020. Only 3% of our students were identified as limited English proficiency, to when this data was taken, it was pulled off. It was based on 2024, which is almost 10%. And we in 2025, we currently have 712 students that are considered limited English proficient. So between 2024 and 2025, we've seen a significant increase in the number. That number is approximately 14% at this point, if we were going to really roll that out to a percentage standpoint. So we're seeing continued growth. This graph also identifies that some students may be identified in more than one category. So they might be limited English proficient, but also identified with a disability, or they might be economically disadvantaged that are also ELL. So it doesn't, it's a significant growth, but it doesn't mean that 50% of our students are in that category of one of those three, because many of those kids may have more than one designation, and we didn't chart that out to be a number. But the point of this is seeing the continued growth that we're having in our district, as we have identified that we are a beautifully diverse community serving increased needs of students. And we have students, for example, that are coming into our district that are limited English proficient, that require necessary services for us to educate them properly. And so that's the challenge that we have in Kings. If you go to the next one, Mrs. Gould, you will see how our current neighbor groups in 2024 relate to that. So Lebanon is the first school. Then we have Kings, Little Miami, Mason, Sycamore, Loveland, Springboro. You can look at some comparisons on the number of students that are considered economically disadvantaged, the students with disabilities, which we're higher than most in our district, and we are seeing significant growth in the limited English proficiency population, which looks vastly different than other districts that we are neighbors with. Only Mason has a larger limited English proficient population. And this is, again, based on 2024. We know those numbers that now are much higher, but this gives a little bit of comparison. So oftentimes it's easy, again, for us to look at neighbors and compare to our neighbors, but each district is individual. And if you look at Springboro, it looks just a little bit different as terms of of diversity within that school district. And so we're beautifully unique in Kings and celebrate and are extremely happy with the students that we have. But these also are students that deserve a high quality Kings education that require resources to effectively deliver that instruction and grow them as our community and our parents expect. So this is information that I think is important for us to look at. I'll stop here on enrollment, but I think this is important for us as we've identified that we have seen increased cost in our district due to the diversifying needs of our students. And I think the And it's absolutely necessary for us to do that for what's best for our kids. But this data identifies specifically the challenges that we are having, some of which, and I'll point out, is that currently we have the 712 students that are limited English proficient. And the state of Ohio provides us with approximately $180,000 total to educate those 712 students. That is not as barely enough for what would be 2 ESL teachers in a population that is significantly growing and more intense. So we believe we're vastly underfunded by the state to effectively support our students that need this, and it increases the amount of dollars that we have to use from our general fund to continue to educate students. And so we're, again, underfunded from the state, and this is part of our advocacy that Mike will talk about in a little bit as well. So I'll stop on enrollment if there's any questions, and then I have a few more pieces.
Does the state see this data?
Yes, this is taken straight from the CUP report, which is a state report. It's generated. These are all, everything I took is external. So the state has access to all of this information. Yes.
So they see it and choose to do nothing.
I think our formula right now it doesn't benefit us because Mike will probably say it a little better and a little differently than me, but Kings is considered a high wealth district because we have high income levels. Our property values continue to increase, and the state views us as a locally funded school district. That basically says that we believe we're going to use our resources based on the formula other places, and Kings is locally can support the needs of our kids, which puts a burden on our community.
Right.
I don't know if you want to say that differently, Mike. More treasury.
Pretty much nailed it.
Thank you.
Even with the increase in economically disadvantaged students, that formula doesn't change because of that extraordinary high increase.
It's its own separate category of funding. And this year we received less than $100,000 to help support those students from the state. So they basically pull it out as their own line for they call it DPIA, which is basically helping economically disadvantaged students. And we got less than 100,000 this year.
Question for you. Is there, like a bullet point list of things that I don't know how to say this, things that we do to help those students learn that we pay extra for? Is there a list of those items so we kind of understand like a typical ESL kit, what even technology would they need in order to have more translating abilities, and how much does that technology cost? Is there any sort of data or a list?
Yeah, I think we can get that to be.
Yeah.
Dana, if you want to answer that, or
I think we have to look at everything's a little bit different. And
Sure.
every language is a little bit different. Yes, we can get you in general idea.
I could rattle off about 5 things off the top of my head, just thinking through it. But we'll provide the board with something a
Okay.
little more
Not
comprehensive.
broken down
and
per
com-
kid, but just an idea
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
types of things
Yeah,
that
like reading teachers and tutors and English second language teachers and technology tools, just rattling interpreters. Mhm.
And that depends on grade level too. Now, the State Department used to give school districts an idea of the number of students with some type of disability, the percentage that you should have in a district. Do they still do that? This is the first year they stopped it. Okay. I've been doing it until this report card is not on.
so I think good.
So based on the fact they give more money to students in Mason and Kings, are you saying that the state sees Kings as being higher wealth than Mason?
No, there's some historical context into that as well. So for example, or actually for a reason, Mason used to get a substantial amount of local money from um, personal property tax. And so it's property on or taxes on business property, like machines, for example. And they phased that out. And the state basically gave money to replace that funding. And then that funding from the states just kind of carried forward throughout history. So it's hard to compare apples to apples today of amounts that you get from the state because you have something that happened in the early mid 2000s that is still affecting state funding today. That's correct. That's correct. But they had a larger share in Mason from the bigger businesses. Uh-huh. Correct. Yeah. Hmm.
One more question.
Hmm?
Per pupil state funding, do you have that broken down by our neighbors?
We'll see it here in a few minutes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, you're going to see exactly that. You're
One step ahead, sorry.
No, that's what we like. So we'll, the next section I want to talk about is a little bit of staffing. One of the things we continually analyze is how efficient are we? Are we in line with other districts? So what pulled some quick data recently, just again from the ODE. This is based on 2023. It's not updated for the last year or so. But when you look at staffing ratios, so if you look at the total number of staff we have in our district and we compare that to our neighbor peers, you can see where the average is there, but you can see we're very in line, if not have higher ratios than many of the districts that are around us. And when you're looking at that number of staff and students, that's a considerable number each little decimal point. So from a peer, all staff neighbor peer group, we perform a little bit higher. So now the next one goes into our ODU peer group, those top 10, the school districts that are near us as far as the state analysis. You could see our staffing ratios are higher than all the other districts that we're compared to across the state. What that speaks to us is that we run fairly efficient, comparatively speaking. Our ratios are higher. We are lean in many areas as far as staffing goes. This is a number that we're continually to analyze how we compare. I think it would, if it was the lower the number, the more staff per students we have. The higher the number, the less staff per students we have. And so this comparison allows us to look across the state and say that we're running at a fairly efficient level here in Kings compared to our statewide peers and our neighbor peer group. The next one I just pulled out, just quickly, a lot of times we look at the counseling ratios often come up across the state or the districts. You can see in Kings, our ratios for the counseling staff we have in our district this is basically our average caseloads. For Kings is 447. And you could see that we compare favorably to where other districts are as far as the number of counselors per student. So that can be looked at a few different ways, but it's also from an efficiency standpoint, we are maxed out about as high as we could go as far as where we want to be to support our students through the counseling perspective, but we are certainly not overstaffed in that area. The next one I want to look at is administrators. This always draws question is how many administrators Kings has. And we have too many or extra, or there's question about what that looks like. So in our administrator ODU peer group, you could see our highlighted as where we are. We are certainly in line or above most of our peers across the state. There are some that are significantly higher ratios. But as far as across the state overall, we are in line or higher than most as far as those administrative ratios per student. If you look at our neighbor peer group, it's oftentimes let's look across where we are from our neighbors. Again, we're very in line with where our neighbors are as well. You could see some look a little different on both ends of the spectrum, but by and large, we are right down the middle on comparing where we are as far as number of administrators per student on that ratio base. So let's move into cost per pupil. So if we look at the overall per pupil expenditures based on the ODU top 10, our peers across the state, that's that same group that you've seen throughout this entire presentation. We've highlighted where Kings, we are significantly below the average of those top 10 groups and fall towards the bottom as far as the overall cost per pupil. Again, this is taken from the CUP report. This is formalized statewide data. It's not something that Mr. Morrow and I create. We have access to can pull this off, but you could see where we perform. Most of this is going to be comparing to the state. I will put in our overall cost per pupil. The next one, Don, please, is our neighbor group. So you can see where we in Kings land compared to our neighbors. So we are basically on the average, with about $100, a little over $100 on the average, compared to our neighbors. I think it's important to look as well as around some of the enrollment data that we showed earlier, and there's some comparisons to per pupil expenditure to it can do some analysis on diversity as well. But you will see where we are from a per pupil and neighbor. We are at that average of just those folks that touch us or similar. The next one is administrative cost per pupil. So from the ODU top 10, these are our comparison districts across the state. You can see where our administrative costs per pupil in Kings is at the bottom and significantly below the average of the districts that we compare to. The next one is instructional expenses. Top 10 peers ODU across the state. Significant below average towards the low end of instructional expenses. The next one is operational expenses. And I generalize these for this discussion, but you can see where we rank as far as our top 10, as far as overall spending from an operational perspective. So what you're seeing in those last three slides are high levels of efficiency as far as cost per student from administrative perspective, instructional expenses, and operational expenses. So in general, summarize a lot of this, we have a growing diverse population. We're continuing to see an increase. We have highly efficient staffing levels across the board, especially when we compare to our peers across the state. And we're running operationally, administratively, on a per pupil cost basis very efficiently as we compare as well. A lot of that's due, I would say, to the work the board has done over the last few years in trying to become more efficient. The $7.2 million matters because that helps change some of these numbers that we see within this comparison. And so when we start to look at a lot of the things, there's in any analysis you do, there's not a lot that stands out here that says we can continue to tap into to increase the efficiencies that we have in our district. But I think as a board and a community, it's always good to know where you stand because you just don't have that comparison sometimes. I think it's important to see. The last thing I'll say, I'll get to Mrs. Groff's question, is the per pupil revenues. This is how much the state, from the CUP data, this is from 2024. We do not have the most recent one as far as this analysis. This is our neighbor peer group and how each district right near us, what they receive from the state level. So to Mrs. Cowan's question and point you were making earlier, you will see a difference between Mason and Kings at about $1,000 more per student. That's based on that historical perspective of the significant amount of personal tangible property tax that Mason had, that when the Fair School funding formula went in play in 2020, there was a commitment not to fund Mason less than what they were currently getting. So that is factored into, continued to factor into the formula. But you could see what that looks like. And how, when we say Kings is a locally funded school district, state of Ohio looks at our formula in comparison. It says we have the means in our community through our property values and our income levels that our community will need to continue to support the school district. So I think that was the comparison you were looking for, Mrs. Groff, on where we are from a state per pupil revenue.
I'll just add on this one. About 2 years ago, the state used to actually report out all of the different money that you get from the state. And the board, you may remember, I remember pretty vividly, but when we looked at just what we were getting in the base state funding through our foundation payments, it was a lot more stark than this difference between us and other districts. They don't report it like that anymore for some reason. I don't know why, but this is a combination of a lot of different money that you get from the state. But if you took this and just applied more of a pure pupil foundation like they did a couple of years ago, I'd be curious to see what it looked like, because it was drastic. We were like how Sycamore was at the bottom compared to everybody else when we looked at that piece of it. But for whatever reason, it went away. And we always try to source the information from like this cup report that ODE puts out. So it's kind of unfortunate that we can't see it like that anymore. But it was stark and very troubling to see it in the other manner, whereas this makes it look a little bit closer than it maybe should. Just speculating. So Don, if you could go to the next slide. We talked about enrollment at the very beginning of how we're still a growing district in a world where schools are continuing to lose enrollment across the state. I wanted to chart out kind of what the money from the state that we're actually getting is. So you can look at it per pupil or on the kind of aggregate like this is, and we're getting more kids and they're actually taking funding away from us. So the 24-25, that's going to be relatively close to last school year compared to this school year. And then we've also built in projections for the governor's budget. So if Governor DeWine's budget came through as he proposed it, we would see a pretty substantial drop of, almost $1 million year over year as we continue to grow and we continue to have expenses grow for the needs of our students. So it's kind of tough to see it this way. And then Don, if you go to the next one, it's pretty tough to see it this way too. $2 million less over this year and the next two compared to what we would have got if they would have kept us flat with last year. So we're talking about the state just simply taking $2 million from us over a 3-year period as we deal with the same inflation and cost increases that everybody else is in their home and businesses. And this continues to shift burden on our community to fund education. So it's kind of a sad state of affairs for Kings when it comes to the state funding side of it. Mr. Sears alluded to this, but we have a state funding group with about 8 community members, and I've included the board on some of this communication of ways that we can get involved, in ways that we are trying to advocate for increased funding levels in Kings. We can't put expectations too high and that we're going to completely kind of break the system and get huge increases in Kings, because the reality is at the state level, the pie is the pie. And if they give more money to us, they got to take it from somewhere else. But we need to fight for some level of increases in certain items, such as don't take money from us, especially if we're continuing to grow. I mean, it sounds relatively simple, but really, we're getting more kids, we're getting more diverse. We need all the funding. Also, another big push is for categorical funding. So this is money to help with our diversity, especially in the English second language and the special education population. So we're working through those bullet points or talking points, sending form letters to our local and high-powered or high-influence state legislators, and then also set up meetings throughout the spring to actually touch base with those folks and include community members in the conversation because we like to say this, and it's the reality that they hear from superintendents and treasurers belly aching all the time. But if we can get some community members in the room talking about their own story and their own experiences, living in a school district that lives this world where the state continues to underfund us and then take away an already underfunded amount, just how tough that is on the community and individual households. So there's work to do in this, and we're hopeful that that 2 million doesn't become a reality, but that's what the governor put out based on our projection. So we don't have a great starting point. We're fighting an uphill battle.
Are any of our peer schools seeing potential $2 million decreases?
We're looking at decreases for the most part in the county, especially because they're going to change that guarantee amount where currently the state says we're not going to give you any less than we gave you in 2020. It's almost kind of laughable because it's based on 2020, which is a 5-year-old number at this point. But they're starting to erode away at that. In a lot of districts, 5 of the 7 in the county basically are relying on that number from 2020. So as they erode that, it affects the majority of the county and a lot of districts across the state. And that was directly in his proposal. And that goes against historically what's happened across the state, because normally they say, at the very least, if you're not losing kids, we're not going to give you less. But in his proposal, it doesn't matter whether or not you're gaining kids, we're still going to give you less. So it was something that nobody really saw coming and would have expected. So, as I said, uphill battle, but there's a team of schools in Warren County, everybody who's working on these similar bullet points to try to send the message to the state that how damaging it is when they enact things like this. So.
The overall challenge, and I'll just conclude with this, if there's no more questions, is, I think we wanted to highlight tonight that when we say that we're a growing, diverse school district, you have evidence and data that supports that. When we say we're running efficient and lean, and we've made a lot of efficiencies around the edges that don't impact the instructional experiences, you see where we compare across the state. And then you also see that we're losing state funding potentially, which makes the formula here and the reliance on our community even greater. And it puts a burden on the board to be faced with really difficult decisions on the financial future of our school district. And so this isn't a tea and roses. This is a get real conversation for us to understand that, we have an obligation and a duty to educate and serve kids. And we do that very well in Kings with the limited resources that we have. And it's really hard to fathom having less resources to do that as we continue to grow in our experiences with our kids. So we appreciate just the engagement from our community. We've had awesome sessions with our community advisory team, with our state funding advocacy group, highly engaged, doing good work. And we're advocates with our county association, multiple statewide associations that we are engaged in this work all the time. So we're hoping for some better news eventually. I do not anticipate that there is a windfall coming to our district, because that's not the way the formula is set up. We're just trying not to lose as much. So that's kind of the big push for us at this point. So appreciate the board's engagement. We'll get some information that was requested. We'll have that ready for next week. And then if there's any other questions, we'll take those.
The tab that shows the per pupil expense and the per
Mhm.
pupil state funding, can we get those added to the fiscal responsibility
Absolutely.
tab on the website?
It's great.
Otherwise, I'll call you
It's great.
all the time for them
Love
like I
that.
normally do.
Love that idea.
Okay.
It's sad when we think about the burden to our community to keep funding schools. And then as a district, that's one burden. The next burden is the cost of just educating students and how all of the prices are going up. And then that the state, on top of all of that, is cutting some of the funding. So definitely a depressing story right now.
I agree. And I also think it's not fair to our teachers, our counselors, and our administrators. Like we're running at such great ratios and we should be able to supply them with more help. But then the state funding doesn't allow us to do that.
Any other questions or comments from the board? Thank you, Mr. Sears and Mr. Morrow, for that presentation. Moving to our next agenda item, we have discussion items for the treasurer. Mr. Morrow?
Thank you. Items 1 and 2, typical minutes from the prior month. Ask if the board can take a look at those over the next week and let me know if there needs to be any changes. We also have the financial items, our typical monthly financials where we compare the forecast to more actual and accurate data based on changes throughout the year. So we're 8 months in. There's some good news to report here. We're running better in revenues and expenses than forecasted, which is always great. We're within about 1% on both. So we haven't seen a huge windfall, but we are running a little better than projected. Say this every time I present the forecast twice a year. I try to be realistically conservative in both of these because if we're within 1% the wrong way, then we get a $1 million windfall. If we are 1% the wrong way, then it's $1 million into our savings account that we have very, very small savings account anyway. So looking good so far. Revenue's up about 500,000 over projections. That's primarily due to interest rates remaining high. Earlier in the year, we thought we would see some cuts in interest rates, so our interest revenue would be down. But without those cuts, it's remained strong. Looking at about $800,000 this year in interest for our investments, which is awesome. It's just 800,000 added to the bottom line. Expenses, we're running about 700,000 better than what we projected at the last forecast. I was pretty aggressive when I put projections in for special services. We've seen astronomical increases the last couple years. So I didn't think I could make the estimates high enough. So I overshot it a little bit, which is better than the other way. So now that we're 8 months in, started to kind of back off on that a little bit. So that's great news that we're coming in under. And if the board has any questions as they look at this, you can call me or you can ask me next month or next week, excuse me. Uh,
Any questions for Mr. Morrow?
I just was going to ask you to clarify when we make that kind of money, that kind of revenue due to interest rates, that is baked into the 5-year forecast, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just didn't want someone to say, well,
I got a windfall of 800 grand.
exactly.
No. So we bake in a certain level based on projections and projected income, interest rates. So we had built in about 600,000, but now it looks like we're going to be at 800,000. So that's kind of that 200 delta that we've seeing, which is awesome because it's just money added to the bottom line. So I know it hurts the kind of the world when interest rates are high, but this is one place where it helps us. So
Thank you.
I
Thank
thought
you.
the same thing, Stacy. I appreciate you clarifying that.
Number 4 is the tax rate resolution. So back in January, the board approved asking the county budget commission, which is the auditor, treasurer, and prosecutor, to continue all levies and levy our bond at the 7 mills that was promised during the bond levy, 7 mills for debt. And the county did agree to the 7 mills for debt and to continue all of our operating levies and permanent improvement. So that's just the formal spelling that out, that the board is still approving that as well. Number 5, estimated revenues and expenses for the year. We've seen some changes in some of our grants. So to add a little perspective first, we estimate our revenues and expenses, one based on the forecast for our main operating accounts. And then we also have various federal grants and state grants that kind of get built into this estimates of revenues and expenses. So as those grants change, we have to update the revenues. So we've seen about an additional $100,000 in federal grants over what we thought we were going to get earlier in the year, which is great news. So this is the board. I'm asking the board to reapprove the estimated revenues and expenses, with the primary changes being to the federal and state grants. Number 6, this is related to IRS compliance with our debt and note issuance. So this is me asking the board to contract with our bond counsel, Dinsmore, to provide compliance calculations for our $100 million note and 24 million or bond and $24 million notes. So basically, the IRS says you can't earn more interest on money you have sitting in the bank than what you're paying in interest as a nonprofit, non-taxable debt issuance. So this is paying them to calculate that so we can report to the IRS. It's on a daily basis, so you have to be basically a bond tax expert to be able to do this. So this is Dinsmore's great. We have a high level of confidence in them, and they do this for a living. So
that works a little differently than myself as an individual. I get to collect all of the interest. But we're kind of capped or cut off.
we're capped. That's absolutely right. So every year you have to do a calculation to see how did you make more interest than what you're paying? Because if so, you need to know that so you're not potentially spending any of that interest when you can't keep it. You got to give it to the government. And that's because it's tax exempt debt. So they aren't going to let you earn a bunch of interest over what you're paying. So, but yes, you're right. And then number 7, public records log. You see, we're in pretty decent shape. Have 2 outstanding from the last week. Should be able to get those in the next week or so. So I'm in pretty good shape there.
Thank you for keeping on top of those.
Absolutely.
Anything else for Mr. Morrow? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on our agenda, we have our discussion items for the superintendent. Mr. Sears?
Yep, 2 things tonight. I'm gonna start with number 2 first. These are 2 field trips, out of town trips for next school year. So we've got some overachieving folks that are doing a great job getting these in early. First one is the chamber choir in 2026 going to Carnegie Hall in New York. And then the junior high traditional 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. in October of next year. So next week we'll ask you to approve both of those, but those are for a year from now. So we like it when they're proactive. Number 1 is an OFCC phase submission. So this is part of the normal OFCC process, basically looking at our schematic design phase of the high school project. and a resolution to kind of approve the work that's been done. I'm going to lob it to Mr. Lucky for a little bit additional explanation and any questions that you might have.
So like Mr. Sears said, this is one of those milestone moments as we move from schematic design into design development. Just to give you a little update, we're getting closer to wrapping up the DD phase, getting into that next stage of budgeting. So HTC will go through and give us our next swipe. Probably in about the next 30 or so days, we'll start to see some information from that. The other two documents, this is the very front end of the ELP project. So there's lots of more moving parts and pieces to those sheets as we continue to move forward with the locally funded initiative, those LFIs, and those partnered dollars and cents. We talked, feels like 100 years ago, about starting this ELP and locking into that 26%. So the items in our projects right now that meet those criteria will get that coupon or that check at that time for that 26% of what is matched. So very open-ended. You never know when you're going to get it, but we are banking those credits for when that time is to come and our number is called. So again, milestone moment, says, hey, you're going into DD, we're in DD. Once we come out of DD, there's more layers to this, and those numbers will tweak as the design is more fine-tuned. Our architects are working really hard right now for that, to get us to that permitting phase so that we can break ground, and this thing moves at a pace that it's going to be very exciting over there. You're all kind of seeing with some things I'm sharing with you, the pictures at Columbia, multiply that by 100 at a time. So it's very exciting times coming on that site. So any questions about the ELP and where we are? It's a little early in the process, but these will continue to morph as we get tighter on the design.
Are we tracking towards that 26%, you think?
We will get 26%.
We will.
It's of what number is where it lands. So,
Okay.
if 50% of the total budget, you'll get 26% of that. So
Got it.
there's a few things that OFCC doesn't fund, and an auditorium is one of them. Just certain things, but the requirements we're meeting at the classroom level with the square footage per classroom requirement, a good chunk of this building will qualify for that 26%.
All right.
Yeah, the architects are following the Ohio School Design Manual. It's designed to, here's the playbook, here's what the components, and then as much as we design to those components, we're going to build credit for that. So we're trending fairly well on having a pretty high percentage of this project being compliant. Good. So we won't know exactly till a little later, but we're close. One other construction just update. I know we put out some external video of our high school recently, the new high school. That video in itself was designed and put in place to debut at the Kings Athletic Booster Night to Remember event, which was Saturday night, which is an incredible event. So the audience for that was more of our booster groups. So it had that kind of that feel of the overview in the athletic complex, but then it did dip into the arena. That target audience there is typically your athletic booster group that may have access to that. And just to clarify, we don't have any imaging of the theater or any other internal area. They race Saturday morning to get us a visual of the arena with some preliminary colors put in there. So that was something that was done last minute. We still have yet to see any imagery inside. SHP has, over the course of the last month, has had 26 staff meetings with teachers to identify, and probably 100 emails back and forth from those staff members to our architects around different things. And we feel right now our team is working to sign off on the designs at this point. And so we spent a considerable time today. We're coming back tomorrow It's a milestone moment, as Matt mentions, for us. We sign off on that, and then they put the pen to paper. They drill down to the details, and we start to get I'd say about a month, we'll have another budget estimate on where we are, and then we make adjustments. So it's trending well. We're on pace, and we're continuing on that June 1 groundbreaking. So
Video has 4,300 views since Saturday.
Community's excited about it.
Very much so.
Mr. Lucky, even though the groundbreaking is June, will there be any clearing prior to that?
Probably not.
Okay.
We looked at the cost benefit, and how many weeks it could buy us. Cause we're all at the little bit of the mercy of the, Indiana bat migration. So we looked at that cost benefit and how much time it were to buy us. And right now it doesn't look like it's going to happen. We looked really hard at, what that could look like as far as permitting. It wasn't worth the cost to stage that company twice. So to buy the little bit of time it was going to buy us.
Sure.
Yeah, we're looking at every avenue to expedite the process to get this thing, get it rolling. I'm just excited to see bulldozers out there. It's going to be great.
I think I stepped out of a meeting last week when I saw your email with more pictures from Columbia because I had to check it.
Yeah. Yeah. And Dawn's going to share some stuff out in some future stuff, but Columbia is coming along great. It's a interesting project in that we're kind of working from the inside out. So the first thing that you saw was the seat wall in the courtyard because we can't get back in to do it later. And that's the big reason, we chose to move with that. So the seat wall's actually up and in there. And you guys will see some pictures of that if you haven't already. I'll share those. So we'll start working our way out of the courtyard right now. So the footer is just about complete, and they'll start blocking up the walls possibly Friday, but definitely Monday.
Anything else for Mr. Sears? No. All right, next we have discussion items, Assistant Superintendent HR Business.
Good evening, President Skrull, Kings Board of Education. 4 items under my section this evening. First up, our personnel agenda, beginning with staff resignations, staff miscellaneous items, supplementals and stipends. I would like to point out that these are dominated by our Columbia Intermediate School. Our parent-teacher organization funds a number of clubs and activities after school, so we thank them for that support. And then temporary employment. You'll see a number of summer childcare leads, summer childcare aides. As of today, we believe we are in a strong position from a staffing standpoint as we continue preparing for summer camp. So excited to share that with you tonight. Happy to entertain any questions relative to personnel agenda.
I had a question.
Sure.
I'm trying to find it now. Of course, when I want to, I'll come back. Don't wait. I'll ask you in a
Okay.
minute.
Okay. Second item, board policies, first reading. As I've mentioned previously, every quarter I have an opportunity to sit with our Neola representative, Dr. Norm Burkhart, to review all of the policy updates that are brought forth by Neola and the state, bringing along members of our central administrative team as necessary. This particular update has 28 policies attached to it, 4 of which are new. The other 24 are revisions dating back to 2003. Those 4 new policies. Policy 1422.01 prohibits administrators from using, possessing, or distributing drugs or alcohol on district property. Violations, of course, subject to disciplinary action. Policy 2265 ensures a school and work environment where employees, students, or applicants are not required to adopt specific political beliefs while maintaining compliance with laws and academic standards. Policy 5780.01 recognizes parents' rights to be involved in their child's education, review materials, opt out of certain content, and be informed about significant changes in services. It also establishes a process for addressing concerns. Policy 7421 provides gender-specific multi-occupancy facilities, allows accommodations for special circumstances, and permits access to opposite-sex facilities only in specific cases such as emergencies or assisting a child. Those are our four, just a brief overview of our four policies that are new to this particular adoption.
I appreciate your summary
Sure.
on those policies. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Happy to answer any additional questions relative to our board policy update. Item number 3, we are recommending next week our before and after handbooks update for our childcare programs. There are minor updates. They are highlighted in those documents. Mainly, those are an updated registration process, calendar dates and times, and a sibling discount. So those are the 3 major changes that are relatively minor when looking at the overall program. And then finally, relative to that, our summer camp pay rates. So in an effort to continue to be fiscally responsible, we are proposing a shift from our current column and step scale for summer camp employee compensation to a flat rate for each position. This change will help us budget more effectively, ensure consistency in pay, streamline financial planning, and stay competitive with area-wide summer camp programming. We are very much looking forward to this year's summer camp. Those are my updates for this evening. Thank you.
Under personnel.
Yes.
There was an abbreviation ESY.
Yes.
I'm sure I should probably know what that, I just can't think of what that would mean.
It is extended school year.
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome.
Any other questions for Mr. Spinner?
Shout out to the firecrackers. Although the performance that's going viral online was in that school in Southern Indiana, I love the firecrackers.
Firecrackers appreciate your support.
Thank you, Mr. Spinner.
Thank you.
Next item for discussion is Assistant Superintendent Educational Programs.
Everyone. So Matt is about to take the presentation over in a minute, but I do want to give a shout out to Matt, the instructional coaches, and all the teachers from South Lab, Jeff Burns, Cami, and Columbia, who have worked all year on looking at an ELA program and piloting it in their classrooms and coming back together. And as a group of probably 20 people, even more than that, 18 teachers that are ready to now talk to you about a recommendation around language arts. So I'm gonna let Matt, I'm not gonna steal any more of Matt's thunder, but they've done a lot of hard work this year to get ready for this. So we're kind of excited about it.
I just wanted to start by just stepping you through kind of our process, just so everyone is aware that in addition to explaining kind of what our recommendation is going to be and kind of talk a little bit about the costs, that it isn't something that we've taken lightly at all, that we've taken great thought and care to think about the needs of our students, the needs of our teachers in this particular area. So I just want to preface kind of with that. But just to kind of start a little bit with kind of what we've been working on, some of which I've been updating you as we've moved along. So last year we started a K-12 ELA design team to really create our own vertical alignment document. We did a deep dive into the English language arts standards, really preschool through high school with a group of teachers. So we started kind of with that process, knowing that we had a couple different outcomes based on grade level. So for our grade band 6 through 12, our vertical alignment document was used to develop new curriculum maps that will be ready for implementation next school year. So all this year, Andrea Nichols, one of our instructional coaches for 7-12, has been working with our 6-12 ELA teachers at different points through the school year here at KEC. They've been working really hard to take that vertical alignment document and to kind of retool their curriculum maps, their scope and sequence, and also started looking at materials that they might need to fill in some gaps. Those materials can take the look of digital resources, potential options, or in the future, some required reads that they're kind of grappling with right now that we could talk about later. For K-5, however, there's a different kind of outcome for ELA materials. So the state of Ohio passed a bill last year requiring all districts to adopt a new English language arts curriculum resource from a state approved list. So knowing that vertical alignment that we were working on this time last year was leading toward a recommendation. So that's kind of where we are. So as we have developed this new ELA alignment, our team, me, our instructional coaches, we started researching these state approved options. So the state has on a fairly regular basis released lists of published materials that we can begin to look at. We participated in vendor fairs. We talked with many publishing representatives. We talked to other school districts that were using programs that we were considering. And so ultimately, we wanted to kind of narrow down that list to look at programs that we thought would best, as I said, meet the needs of our students, our teachers, that would align to our goals around personalized learning and also the Power Five. So we were preparing for a pilot in the spring of last year. And the next slide. As we were preparing for the pilot in the fall, we used a high quality instructional materials rubric with our K-5 ELA teachers to look at 3 different curriculum resources in ELA that we had landed on. So these just kind of highlight the areas: high quality text materials, evidence-based discussion and writing, and building knowledge. Those were kind of non-negotiables, areas that every program that we looked at was required to include. You've heard me also speak about the science of reading in recent meetings. And so part of the requirement is that all of these resources we are looking at aligned with the principles of the science of reading. In addition, we just have those other bulleted items there, a range of text, meaning that the required reads for students represented different genres: poetry, plays. We had informational text, literary text, etc. That the programs were designed with appropriate questions, tasks, including good assessments, that there were support materials and guidelines for our English learners, for students with disabilities, and also that the materials were accessible, easily accessible for our staff. So we want to make sure that there's a digital component so that teachers aren't carrying large loads of print materials back and forth to home as they're planning. And then, as I mentioned, just space for the development of our district initiatives around the Power Five and personalized learning. So,
Question.
yes, ma'am.
Just, I know the importance of the vertical alignment and curriculum math. Can you kind of explain that to anyone that might be listening?
Sure.
Because during the adoption, I know we always do that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So when we talk about vertical alignment, we're looking at the standards, in this case, English language arts, at each grade level. So we start looking at kindergarten, and we look at how the expectations in kindergarten blend into first grade, and then how the expectations and content kind of moves forward in a progressive way, so that students are building skills expected in the content area. So the state has a document that does that vertical alignment for you, but it's pretty vague. So what we wanted to do was look at those standards and then talk about what that looks like in the context of a King's classroom. And so our design team worked on those vertical alignments, kind of tried really work to clarify specifics there. And then in PD days this year, we met in vertical teams to review that with all of the staff. So all of our staff has now had an opportunity, K-5, to review these standards.
And
Um,
curriculum map.
Yeah, curriculum maps for 612 are essentially the guidelines of what is taught and when as you progress through the school year. You want to make sure that students are exposed to the standards. It's also a guideline for our teachers to know when we provide assessments and when we're using certain materials.
Another way to, Matt's dead on with all that and appreciate all your work on that. Another way to say that is that the vertical alignment is really important because the standards are set up in a way that you introduce a standard in one grade level, but you don't really assess it until 2 grade levels later. And so that alignment's important to understand that in 3rd grade, you may introduce this content, this standard, but it's really not assessed for mastery in 5th grade until 5th grade. So that alignment basically we have to introduce here, but we don't need to teach it to mastery. And so that's required later when they're assessed. So that alignment's important to ensure continuity, but it also allows our teachers to make sure we're focusing on the right standards at the right grade levels. And so that's a hard thing because when teachers teach things, they wouldn't teach everything to mastery, but it may not be required until later. So that's part of that alignment piece.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That is an important piece. And when you look at the way the standards are written, they are written in grade bands. So you have a K-2 grade band, and then you have a 3-5 grade band, which kind of explains the kind of cutoff at the state level for required text. So after using that rubric and having vendors come in, we had 3 vendors actually do presentations for us. There was one in particular that on that day after lunch, the teachers came back and they said, Matt, we don't like this program. It was kind of universal, kind of surprised me a little bit, but I'm like, okay, it's important for the teachers to, like the resources and kind of what's included there. So we landed on these 2 programs. So the first one there is Wit and Wisdom on the left, and the one on the right is REL education. So the programs really are very similar. When you look at both of these programs have very heavy opportunities for students to engage in writing, which is in contrast to a lot of what we're doing now. Our students, our teachers will tell you, don't do nearly enough writing. So both of these programs kind of are going to help us in that regard. They also provide lots of opportunities for students to engage multiple times in text. So it's very common now that students will read a book one time. These programs are designed such that students go back to that same text multiple times for different reasons. So I was in a classroom last week, actually, and it was a 1st grade classroom, and they were reading. The teacher did a great job of kind of introducing it. She talked about the word famous. They were talking about, let's talk about this vocabulary word famous. What's it mean? Well, they were reading Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss was the book. All of those students have heard that story before in the classroom. They read that entire story. The teacher read it out loud. You know that story. It's repetitive and fairly long, but the kids loved it. But after that, as part of the lesson in kind of a paired situation with the student, each student with their partner dug back into that text for another purpose to answer a question. So that's just one day. They were going to look at that same book 3 or 4 more times. So really opportunity to do some close reading, and again, for specific purposes, leading up toward answering an essential question for that unit. So both of these programs are divided into 8-week modules. So over the course of a school year, students will kind of experience 4 modules. And both of these programs around different topics that are content related. So science and social studies content used to help develop these skills. Wit and Wisdom's kind of focus is writing to learn and learning to write. EL education, their tagline there was read, think, talk, write. So you can kind of see some similarities there. When students are engaged in writing activities, they're working to make their thinking visible. And so not only are they kind of getting their thoughts out on paper through process, they're also then learning the craft of writing through different graphic organizers and experiences that the teachers share in the lesson. So they're learning the craft of writing in addition. Both of them also have different assessments that are included that are writing pieces. So they have mid-module writing assessments and then end-of-module writing assessments. So that's just kind of an overview of both of those programs. The next piece that we looked at was cost. So you heard our presentation earlier, so this is not lost on us that this is an expensive endeavor. But this is kind of the information as we were kind of doing this portion of recommendation. So EL cost proposal, you can see there was $466,000 and some change. That included all print materials. EL education is actually an open resource curriculum, which means that it's available for free online. So you can get on and look at the lessons and the scope and sequence, but all of the print materials you have to purchase. So that's where that first number comes from. Those are all print materials. Then the program developers also have professional development estimates. And so those estimates kind of ranged based on a low touch at $70,000 for next year to a high touch professional development package, which was $115,000. So that's kind of EL in a nutshell. The Wit and Wisdom cost proposal was roughly $325,000. That included all the print materials. Wit and Wisdom does have a digital license, both for teachers and students. That's included in that cost, as well as an assessment and reporting platform. And then professional development estimates from Wit and Wisdom Publishing is $39,000 next year. So Wit and Wisdom does have a estimated recurring cost for digital licenses. So those are both for students and teachers. And so we're looking at a $325,000 initial outlay for all the prep materials and resources to get started next year, and then $40,000 a year for digital pieces. And of course, those costs do not include any added classrooms that might come in the future, replacement materials that are expected over time, because there are a lot of trade books that are used in the different classes. I wanted to do kind of a little bit of a comparison to put that number in perspective a little bit, because we haven't adopted an ELA program at the elementary for quite a while. So we last did this work in 2016. And so we spent in 2016 $433,000, and that was for a K-4 adoption of benchmark education. So that included all of the print materials, teacher kits, et cetera. And then we spent an additional $119,000 in subsequent years for increased enrollment, teacher kits. Greg talked about, we've added students, so we've added classrooms, and so we had to buy extra materials for those additional classrooms. So when you think of inflation and kind of how the world changed post-COVID, this is not as bad as I was expecting. I don't know what my buddy Mr. Morrow over there thinks about that, because he has a different job to figure out how he wants to pay for it. But that's kind of where we are. Ultimately, then our next slide here is what we landed on. So in all of the conversation, I had an opportunity to visit and talk with every teacher that's piloting the program. We landed on Wit and Wisdom as our recommended resource. And I just listed some bullets there of kind of why we landed there. We met twice. I neglected to tell you that this teaching team that piloted the program, we looked at the resources. All of those teachers received training in December on those resources. They received their items and then started piloting after the winter break. So they've been working on this since January. We met as a team again in early February as kind of a check-in and to talk about similarities. And then we met again on March the 4th to kind of do a final check-in and to see if we were ready to make a recommendation. And so this is kind of where we landed. Wit and Wisdom is a knowledge-based curriculum. It has high-quality, engaging text that teachers report that students really were enjoying in the module that we piloted. As I said before, every module includes opportunities for students to engage in writing, which is an area of need for us, for sure. It includes good instructional strategies. We talk a lot about instructional strategies that are used in the classrooms. So it's a nice framework. It is not a scripted program, but it is a nice framework for teachers to utilize. Even specifically, I was in a 4th grade classroom over at JF Burns, and the students were doing a discussion, and in the teacher resources, there were some guiding questions. Your students, based on the story that you read, will very likely say this. Here is how you can respond to get them to think in a little different way. So it kind of preemptively shares through the design some predicted ways that students are thinking so that we can kind of push them to meet the objective of that lesson. So the other thing that I like about it is that Wit and Wisdom is a very Power 5 friendly. When we think about communication, when we think about critical thinking and problem solving and collaboration, all of those skills are deeply embedded in this program. And every student is going to be engaged at an appropriate grade level task that's going to help develop those skills. So students will be doing what's called a Socratic seminar in early as kindergarten, which is an opportunity for students to kind of circle up and talk a little bit about a discussion question or a text that they've read or a piece of art that they've looked at. And that's something you typically haven't seen until students are much older. So that's just an example of an exciting thing that's to come. Thanks, Dana. So there are, of course, a series of required texts that come with each unit. And so I've enlisted the help of Mr. Chamberlain down there. What we're doing is we're taking all of the required texts and we are running those titles through a similar process that we use for our collection development for our library system. So if there's anything there that raises a red flag, we'd be able to see that we might be able to make an adjustment. So that's not a part of a state requirement. That's just something that we felt prudent in Kings to kind of add to our process as well. So Chris is working on that, and so far so good. Nothing's come up that we think is alarming, but any questions for me or Mr. Morrow?
I guess for Mr. Morrow, like there was a bill that was passed to mandate this, but the state doesn't assist the districts in paying for that?
What do you call it? Semi-funded or partially?
I
Or
call it a sort of funded mandate.
Sort of funded
It's
mandate.
a sort of funded mandate. It's
Sort
not
of.
an unfunded, but it's a sort of funded mandate.
So we saw this, we knew it was coming, and the state sent us $86,000 last year and said you have until the end of this year to adopt something and spend the $86,000. So I've built in with the expectation from working closely with Mr. Sears and the teaching and learning team that we knew it was coming. So I've built in costs into the forecast to see it, but yeah, they gave us 86. Might have been 85,600 to be a little more exact.
Sort
but
of funded.
Sort of funded, yeah.
So
They-
for
they
2
based
licenses,
that-
2 years of license.
Correct.
They based that amount
And then
on
it
a
takes that.
survey that we had to complete actually early last fall of what resources we're using. So
Thank you.
other questions or comments?
What did the print So what do the print materials consist of? 'Cause that seems to be the bulk of the upfront cost. Is that, because I know you just talked about staff being able to look at it online. So
Yeah.
what is that?
So there are print teacher materials that are available also online in a digital format, but there are materials that just come with a teacher kit. So we can't elect not to have that.
Right.
It just is part of the package, but it also includes all of the trade books for every
okay.
module. Yeah, so in some cases, it's one book because it might be a read aloud that the teacher reads. In other cases, every student has a book in their hands. Sometimes they're working with partners, and there are 4 or 5 required texts in each module. So that's a number of books, each grade level that is included in that cost.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. So
Yeah.
we don't have to supplement that. That's built in.
And I just want to say, literature review.
Yes.
That's really,
Yes.
really forward to do that.
I'm going to throw that out, that was Matt's idea to do. So he kind of said, we're going to do that, Dana. And I'm also been very proud. Matt has gone to every single classroom that's been piloting the program and sat down and talked to the teacher and watched the students. So like he has seen this for both sides. He saw both programs many times. He's been in the buildings a lot. So this has been very in-depth for the instructional coaches and Matt. This has been a lot of this year.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda, we have items presented by the board. Do we have anything we would like to present this evening?
I just want to say thank you to the administrative team sitting around that with looking at the work from Columbia and behind the scenes, getting the high school ready to start. I know as a board, we haven't taken any of your job description things that you do each and every day off, but it seems like we've piled quite a bit more on. So really appreciate all of the hard work that you're all doing to make sure we have the best edition in high school that the state can produce for us.
Thank you.
Well said, Mrs. Ford.
Very well said.
All right, next on our agenda, we have executive session. We will be entering into executive session for the following purpose: to consider the employment of a public employee or official. There should not, no action will be taken.
You just have to call roll to go in, but.
Oh, right, yeah. Can I have a motion to go into executive session?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second the motion.
Mr. Morrow?
Mr. Belfrom,
Yes.
Ms. Groff,
Yes.
Ms. Phillips,
Yes.
Ms. Cowan.
Yes.
Mr. Skrull.
Yes. Please note that this is the last item, so once we come out of executive session, we'll be adjourning our meeting. Thank you.